Squash is one of those vegetables that I really like to grow in my gardens, but it can be a tricky crop to grow well, especially in the maritime climate of Ireland. Our summers are relatively cool, and the frost-free growing season is not very long, and the winds that we get can be an issue for the big tender leaves of these plants. I used to be quite frustrated with this, as squash is one of my favorite vegetables in the kitchen, but now I quite enjoy the challenge. With vegetables that are quite easy to grow in this climate, I find that I don't learn so much or as quickly. But with marginal and difficult crops like squash and pumpkins, I find that there's lots of opportunities for learning, mainly through failure or at least lack of success. For the past few years, I've been growing the same variety of squash in 6 of my family scale gardens, and the differences between the years and between the gardens has been quite interesting. This year started off quite well, with the plants growing strongly for the first half of the season, mainly due to protection that I gave the young plants early on. But then the conditions for the rest of the season didn't allow the plants to properly finish what was started. I still ended up with a lot of squash, but they weren't as good as I think they could have been. The 6 batches of this variety of squash were grown in a total area of about 65 square meters and produced 90 mature squash at the end of the season, which weighed a total of 304 kilograms, more than half of which came from the much larger planting of the simple garden. This averaged out to be 4.7 kilograms of squash for each square meter of growing space, which was noticeably more than the 2018 season, but basically the same as the 2017 harvest. Overall, this seems to be a fairly consistent harvest over the past few years, but when I looked at the number of mature squash produced each season, the results seemed quite a bit different. In the previous 2 seasons, each plant had only grown on average of just over 2 mature fruit each, but this season, 3.6 squash were produced per plant on average, not counting the immature fruit that would not have had a chance to develop properly. And the typical weight of each squash that I harvested this season was slightly lower than it has been. So overall, there was a slightly larger total weight of the harvest, but consisting of a lot more squash that were generally quite a bit smaller. And this was despite the fact that it was the same variety of squash grown in the same size of beds, and the number of plants remained relatively consistent. Looking at the detail of the yields this season across the 6 gardens, the crop of squash from the extensive garden was significantly lower, but a certain amount of this can be expected. The yield from the polyculture garden was really low, which dragged the average for the year down quite a bit. Looking at all the plantings of this variety of squash that I've made since 2016, this season's harvest from the polyculture garden is the lowest ever, and the result of a few key errors that I made. The only other batch that was almost as bad was the 2017 crop from the extensive garden, where I had tried an experiment of direct sowing that didn't work. The yield this season from the polytunnel garden was about the same as it was last year, but the other 4 gardens had 20 to 50% higher yields compared to last year. I find this quite interesting, as last season we had an extended period of unusually hot weather, during which these heat-loving squash plants should have thrived. But I suspect that there just wasn't enough water in the soil during these hot and dry conditions, and the cool autumn that followed prevented these plants from really taking advantage of the heat from earlier on in the summer. This season we've had much more consistent soil moisture levels, but it hasn't been so warm, so the higher yields are a bit unexpected. I think a really big factor here is the extra protection that I gave the young plants because of the cool and windy period of weather that we had just as the plants needed to be transplanted into the garden beds. In 4 of the gardens, I used a double layer of fleece and crop cover stretched over buckets and containers filled with water in order to create a better microclimate with reduced wind and higher temperatures. The containers of water served both as a support for the crop material and as a thermal mass to help keep the plants warmer overnight. But in the polyculture garden, I had only used a single layer of crop cover and had removed it earlier than I had in the other gardens, as the runner bean plants that had been transplanted into the same bed at the same time needed poles to climb. This lack of protection during the cool weather that we had at the beginning of the season, combined with the fact that I didn't add enough fertility into the soil, meant that these squash plants in this garden really suffered. The number of plants that I've grown in each garden over the years has remained fairly consistent, but the average number of squash that each plant produces has varied quite a bit. This year, most of the gardens had more fruit per plant than they had in previous years, apart from the polytunnel garden, and I suspect that this is an issue of lack of pollination. There was a significant increase in the number of fruits per plant in the extensive garden, and even more in the no-dig garden, but only a slight increase in the intensive and polyculture gardens. Given the few errors that I made, I'm not surprised about the lower number of fruits that were set in the polyculture garden, but I do wonder why the plants in the intensive garden didn't follow the trend of the other gardens. In the simple garden, the increase in the number of squash per plant was huge, more than double the average of the other gardens in 2019, and also double what was previously been produced in this garden. There are likely a number of different contributing factors here, but I think the main reason for the big increase is the really good covering that I used in this garden at the start of the season. While the plants in the other gardens were covered with several layers of permeable fleece and crop covers, for the simple garden I used a long sheet of plastic held down with a crop cover. The plastic was positioned so that it didn't touch the ground on the side away from the prevailing winds, in order to make sure that there was enough ventilation. I was really impressed with the exceptionally strong start that the plants in this garden got under this temporary low tunnel or mini polytunnel, despite the cool and windy weather that we had for the first few weeks after transplanting. This better microclimate, combined with the black ground cover fabric, enough soil moisture, and lots of fertility, seemed to have encouraged the plants to produce more fruit, which was a good start to the season. Halfway through the season, I was impressed by the number of squash that I could see growing in among the vines, especially in the simple garden. I was looking forward to a huge yield, but unfortunately the size of the squash at harvest time was smaller than expected. While the intensive garden produced squash with roughly the same average weight, the squash in all the other gardens weighed on average about 20% less than last year, and smaller than at any other time that I've grown this variety. I think the main reason for this is the cool autumn temperatures that we had, or more precisely, we didn't get the period of unseasonably warm weather that was needed for the squash to grow really well. The number of squash that the plants started to produce was based on the extra protection that I'd given the plants at the beginning of the season, and the generally warmer weather at the end of June and for most of July. But the size of the fruit would have been based on the available sunlight and warmth throughout August and September, and it just wasn't warm enough. The plants seemed to really struggle to grow all the squash that were on the vines, and this was especially the case in the simple garden. My gardens are located on a site that generally gets a fair amount of wind, but there were a few days in the middle of August where the wind was a bit stronger than usual, and the large patch of squash plants in the simple garden was quite badly exposed to the strong winds which blew through a gap in the windbreak and up the hill towards the gardens. The squash plants in the other gardens were more protected from these gusts, but the wind harassed the plants in the simple garden quite a bit, causing the large tender leaves to bash against each other. By the end of August, the majority of the leaves in this patch were either dead or severely damaged, and this likely put an abrupt end to the growth and development of this crop. And it was such a shame that the crop that had the most successful start with the strongest plants and the most fruit developing on the vines suffered the worst damage from this wind. Despite all of this, the yields from most of the gardens were higher than last year, and to me this is a good indication that things are moving in the right direction, or at least I'm getting a bit better at managing this crop. I ended up with 300 kilograms of squash, which is a lot to feed ourselves and to share with our neighbors, but unfortunately a lot of the squash didn't seem to be as ripe as they have been in the past. When I cut a few of the squash open, there is still a layer of green underneath the skin, and the flesh isn't the same deep orange color as it has been in the past. The squash is still edible, of course, but it just doesn't have the same sweetness and rich flavor that I've become used to with this variety, and I'm not sure how well this year's crop will store. And this is a real shame, as a little bit more warmth in the autumn could have meant that I ended up with 300 kilograms of really good squash, rather than having 300 kilograms of just mediocre squash. So, there was a lot more to learn this season, especially in comparison to the last few years. There seems to be a definite benefit in covering the young squash plants early in the season, and the closer I can get to the conditions of a mini polytunnel or greenhouse, the better it seems. And it would be great to be able to keep this cover on for as long as possible, even if the weather is warm. And if I'm going to go to the effort of adding this protective layer, then I don't really need to worry about late frost damaging these tender plants. Therefore, I might as well sow the seeds a lot earlier in the season, and take advantage of the warmth that we often get earlier on in the year, and also to provide a longer growing season for these plants. Setting up a windbreak around the squash crops from the beginning of the season would probably help quite a bit, or at least help to reduce the risk of damage, even if it does cause some overshadowing. And I wonder whether it would be worth recovering the mature plants in the early autumn with some form of fleece or other crop cover. This could help to reduce the potential damage from wind, and also raise the temperature a little bit to help the plants mature at the end of the season. But this is a lot of area to cover, especially with the simple garden. Next year, I'm going to plant the same variety of squash in the same gardens once again, and to try to find a balance between the effort and the resources I need to put in and the harvest I can expect. The aim is to create the conditions where these plants can pass that threshold where they can produce an abundant crop of fully mature squash, regardless of the weather conditions that we get, and without me having to put in too much effort or resources. That could be difficult to do, but in the process I'm enjoying the challenge of figuring out what I can do to get a great crop out of plants that normally don't grow well in this climate, and I'm learning a lot in the process.